In the early 1930s, one man could influence gambling dens in New York, heroin routes across Europe, labor unions, politicians, and murder contracts. And he did it without ever becoming the most feared gunman in the room. He didn't carry the biggest gun. He didn't have the loudest temper. Plenty of men in his world were more violent than he was, and most of them are forgotten now, buried under decades of newspaper ink and empty lots in Brooklyn. What he had instead was a talent for organization. While other men fought over street corners, he was drawing invisible lines across an entire country. While other bosses demanded to be feared, he kept asking a stranger question. What if crime could be run like a corporation, with a board of directors, with agreed territories, instead of turf wars, with meetings where other men would have held massacres? The men who ruled the underworld before him called themselves men of honor, and killed each other by the dozen. The system he left behind lasted for more than half a century. Long after he himself had been driven out of the country he reshaped. So tonight, as the lights go down, we're going to sit with a single question. How did the son of poor Sicilian immigrants, a boy who arrived in New York with nothing, who barely spoke English, who was written off by teachers and police alike, quietly redesign American organized crime? Get comfortable. Dim the lights, if you like. This is the story of Charles, Lucky, Luciano. To understand what Lucky Luciano changed, you first have to understand the world he was born into. And that means, for a little while, we're not going to talk about him at all. Because before there was a mafia, at least the mafia as Americans came to imagine it, there was simply chaos. Picture New York City at the turn of the 20th century. The Lower East Side of Manhattan is one of the most crowded places on the planet. Whole families sleep in single rooms. Laundry hangs between tenement buildings like flags of a country that doesn't exist yet. Immigrants arrive by the shipload. Irish, Jewish, Italian, German, Polish. Each group pressed into its own few blocks. Each group carrying its old suspicions and old loyalties across the ocean in steamer trunks. And in those crowded blocks, crime wasn't organized in any way we would recognize. It was closer to weather, a condition of life. There were street gangs, hundreds of them, most no more sophisticated than a dozen young men and a name. The 5 Points Gang, the Eastmans, the Hudson Dusters. They fought over blocks the way animals fight over territory, and their ambitions rarely stretched further than the next robbery, the next protection payment, the next saloon. Above the street gangs sat the local bosses. In the Italian neighborhoods, some of these men had brought a very old institution with them from Sicily. In the old country, it had names: the Honored Society, the Friends of the Friends, and it ran on codes that were already centuries old. Silence above all, loyalty to your village, your blood, your dialect, absolute obedience to the man above you. One of the earliest forms this took in America was the Black Hand. And the Black Hand wasn't really an organization at all. It was a method. A letter would arrive at a shopkeeper's door, decorated with crude drawings of daggers or skulls, demanding money, signed only with the print of a hand, in black ink. Pay, or your store burns. Pay, or your children aren't safe. Italian immigrants were preyed upon almost exclusively by other Italians, men who knew the victims would never trust the police, because in Sicily the police had never once been on their side. One detail about this old world matters more than any other, because it sets the stage for everything that follows. It had no center, no structure, no way to resolve a dispute except violence. If two bosses wanted the same docks, they went to war. If a man felt insulted, he answered with a gun, and the dead man's cousins answered with more guns, and the feud could roll on for years. Crossing the ocean, outliving everyone who remembered how it started. Nobody thought of revenge as a breakdown in the way things worked. Revenge was the closest thing to a rule anyone had. And the old Sicilian bosses, the men Americans would later call the Mustache Petes, they liked it that way. They were conservative men in their own dark fashion. Many refused to work with anyone who wasn't Sicilian, not Neapolitans, not Calabrians, and certainly not Jews or the Irish. Some refused to touch certain rackets they considered beneath their honor. They ran their little empires the way feudal lords ran their villages, collecting tribute, demanding ritual respect, and watching each other across the rooftops, like rival kings. It worked in a fashion when the stakes were small, when the prize was a few blocks of pushcarts and card games. The old ways could hold. But then, in January of 1920, the United States government did something extraordinary. With the stroke of a pen, it outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol across the entire country, and in doing so, it handed the underworld the single greatest business opportunity in the history of crime. Prohibition turned every thirsty American into a customer. Overnight, the money stopped being counted in hundreds and started being counted in millions. And the old structure, the feuding villages, the honor codes, the endless revenge killings, was suddenly sitting on top of an industrial fortune. It had no idea how to manage. Imagine a network of quarreling medieval fiefdoms, suddenly striking oil. The old men saw the money and grabbed for it the only way they knew how, with guns, hijackings, ambushes, betrayals. In Chicago, the beer wars filled the morgues. In New York, rival outfits shot at each other's trucks on dark highways in Westchester and New Jersey. Somebody was going to look at all that blood and all that wasted money and ask whether there was a better way. It just wasn't going to be one of the old men. It was going to be a skinny, hooded-eyed kid from the Lower East Side, a kid the old bosses would never have accepted as one of their own. And that, strangely enough, was exactly why he could see what they couldn't. He was born Salvatore Lucania in November of 1897 in a sulfur mining town in Sicily called Lercara Friddi. His father worked in the mines, in heat and darkness, for wages that could barely keep a family alive. Like millions of others, the Lucanias looked west. In 1906, when Salvatore was 9 years old, the family boarded a ship for America and settled where so many Sicilians settled, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And here is where most gangster stories begin listing the childhood crimes, the truancy, the arrests, the reform school. All of that happened, but it isn't really the story. The story is that Salvatore Lucania didn't fit anywhere. He didn't fit in school, where he understood almost no English and was treated as a problem to be managed, rather than a boy to be taught. He skipped class so often that at 14, he was sent away to a truancy school in Brooklyn for several months. When he came back, he was done with education for good. His formal schooling ended around the 5th grade. The legitimate world didn't hold him either, though he tried it, briefly. He took a job as a shipping clerk at a hat factory for a few dollars a week, and he watched grown men break their bodies for wages that would never buy them anything. His own father was proof. Decades of honest work, and the family still lived crowded into a tenement. To young Salvatore, the message of the neighborhood was simple and brutal. The honest men walked to work in worn-out shoes. the gangsters, rode in cars. The third misfit is the one that would quietly change history. He never fully belonged to his own community either. The Lower East Side was a patchwork of tribes, and the borders between them were real. Italian boys fought Jewish boys. Jewish boys fought Irish boys. Your street told strangers what you were, and what you were told them whether you were friend or prey. Young Salvatore ran a little racket in those years. For a penny or two a day, he offered younger, smaller kids his personal protection on the walk to school. Pay up, or take a beating. It was the Black Hand in miniature, run by a teenager. And then one day, the story goes, he tried it on the wrong kid. A small, skinny Jewish boy from Grodno in what is now Belarus. Quiet, serious, eyes like a ledger book. Salvatore demanded his penny, and the little kid looked up at the bigger Sicilian and told him, in so many words, to go to hell. The boy's name was Meyer Lansky. Now that story has been polished by decades of retelling, and we should be honest, it may be more legend than fact. But whatever the details of that first meeting, what followed is not legend. Salvatore Lucania and Meyer Lansky became friends, then partners, and eventually something closer to brothers, a bond that would last in one form or another for the rest of Luciano's life. Through Lansky came another Jewish kid, younger, handsome, and frighteningly reckless. A boy so wild, his friends said he was crazy as a bedbug. His name was Benjamin Siegel. The world would come to know him as Bugsy. It's hard to overstate how strange this was at the time. In the world of the old Sicilian bosses, this friendship was close to unthinkable. The Mustache Petes wouldn't do serious business with a Jew. Many of them wouldn't do business with an Italian from the wrong province. Blood, village, dialect. These were the borders of trust, and they were not negotiable. And here was this teenager, this school dropout with the drooping eyelid and the quiet voice, building his inner circle out of exactly the people the old world said he should despise. It wasn't idealism. Luciano was no dreamer of brotherhood. It was something colder, and in its way, more radical. He simply didn't believe ethnicity should determine business. Lansky was a mathematical genius who could hold numbers in his head like other men held grudges. Siegel was fearless muscle. Frank Costello, another Italian kid in the circle, had a gift for talking to politicians and police that bordered on hypnosis. Talent was talent, and everything else in Luciano's eyes was superstition. If his young life has a theme, it's that he thought differently. He wasn't stronger or braver or more brutal than the men around him. The streets were full of men like that, and the graveyards were fuller. By his late teens, he was running with the 5 Points gang, alongside names that would become infamous in their own right. In 1916, at 18, he took his first real fall. 6 months for peddling heroin. When he came out with a lesson, though not the one the state intended. Prison didn't scare him straight. It taught him that the risks you take should be worth the money you make, and that a smart man arranges things so that other people take the risks. Somewhere in these years, Salvatore Lucania began going by Charlie. The family name softened into Luciano, and the neighborhood, watching him survive arrests, beatings, and gang wars that killed his friends, started attaching another word to him. Lucky. There are a half-dozen stories about where the nickname truly came from, and we'll meet the most famous ones soon enough. But by the early 1920s, the pieces were in place. Charlie Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello. A multi-ethnic crew of ambitious young criminals standing at the edge of Prohibition. the greatest gold rush the Underworld had ever seen. The old men held the territory and the tradition. What the kids held wouldn't become obvious for another 10 years. Prohibition made Charlie Luciano rich. More importantly, it made him think. Through the 1920s, Luciano and his partners rose fast in the bootlegging trade. They ran whiskey down from Canada and up from the ships waiting in international waters off Long Island. A floating liquor store the newspapers called Rum Row. The money was staggering. By the middle of the decade, Luciano was reportedly clearing hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, at a time when a working man might earn $20 a week. He wore silk shirts now. He stayed in good hotels. The tenement kid was gone. And yet everywhere he looked, he saw waste. Every hijacked truck was waste. You paid for the whiskey. You paid the crew. You paid the bribes. And then some rival outfit took the whole load at gunpoint on a dark road, and now you had to pay for guards and guns, and eventually for funerals. Gang wars wasted money on a grander scale. Business stopped. Police who had been comfortably bought suddenly had to make arrests, because dead bodies in the street embarrassed the politicians who protected everyone. Customers got nervous. Money that should have flowed like water froze solid. Murder was the worst investment of all. Each one created 2 new problems for everyone it solved. A dead rival had brothers. A dead boss had loyal soldiers. The old Sicilian arithmetic of revenge meant that no killing was ever really final. It was just a payment on a debt that never closed. Luciano wasn't squeamish, and it would be a lie to soften him on this point. He ordered violence when he believed it served him, and men died because of decisions he made calmly, over dinner, without raising his voice. But he came to see violence the way an accountant sees a fire in the warehouse, occasionally unavoidable, and always expensive. There was one more teacher in these years, and he may have been the most important of all. His name was Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was a legend in New York, a Jewish gambler and financier of the Underworld. The man whispered to have fixed the 1919 World Series. He was soft-spoken, immaculately dressed, and he treated crime as pure business, a matter of margins and risk. Rothstein took a liking to the young Luciano and began, in effect, to finish his education. He taught him how to dress, conservative suits, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed gangster, how to speak quietly, how to move through good society, how to think in terms of investments and returns, rather than scores and paydays. From Rothstein, Luciano absorbed a vision of what a criminal could be. A businessman among businessmen, invisible, in a good grey suit. So through the 20s, an idea grew in Luciano's mind. Slowly, the way ideas do. He watched the Italian, Jewish, and Irish outfits bleed each other over transport routes that could have simply been shared, for a fee. He watched bosses spend fortunes on wars over insults. He and Lansky talked about it constantly. 2 young men sketching a different kind of underworld, in cigarette smoke. Cooperation between gangs, fixed territories, shared shipping, disputes settled by negotiation, because peace was cheaper than war. Around 1929, some of these ideas took physical form, when leaders of the big bootlegging outfits along the East Coast began meeting and coordinating, a loose cartel some called the Seven Group, and later a famous gathering of gang leaders from around the country at a hotel in Atlantic City. Italians, Jews, Irish, all at the same tables, talking about market share like delegates at a trade conference. The old Sicilians back in New York looked on this mixing with contempt. And every robbery Luciano survived, every war he watched burn money, Every murder that brought nothing but another murder kept pointing him toward the same quiet, dangerous conclusion. Maybe the problem wasn't the gangs at all. Maybe it was the system itself, the codes the old men had carried from Sicily, the blood feuds and village loyalties and one-man rule of jealous little kings, machinery from another century, grinding itself to pieces in the modern world. But before he could test that idea, the old world nearly killed him. One night in October 1929, Luciano was forced into a car by 3 men. What happened over the following hours he never fully explained, and the explanations he did give changed over the years. What we know is that he was beaten savagely, slashed with a knife or an ice pick, his throat cut shallowly, and dumped on a beach in Staten Island, left for dead. Except he didn't die. A police officer found him staggering along the road, his face a mask of blood. He survived, carrying the souvenirs for the rest of his life, a scarred face and a right eye that drooped, giving him that sleepy, unreadable expression the newspapers loved. Who did it? Rival gangsters? Rogue cops? Someone sending a message? The theories multiplied, and Luciano fed the mystery, saying little. But the neighborhood drew its own conclusion. Men who got taken for a ride did not come back. This one came back. That, many said, is when Charlie Luciano truly became lucky. And the timing was almost poetic. Within a few months, the old world he had quietly come to despise decided to tear itself apart in one final spectacular war and hand him the opening he had been waiting for his entire life. They called it the Castellammarese War, and on the surface, it was exactly the kind of conflict the old world had always produced. 2 aging Sicilian bosses fighting to the death over the right to rule. On one side stood Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, heavyset, crude, gluttonous, and utterly ruthless. Masseria had clawed his way to the top of Italian organized crime in New York through the 1920s. He was an old-school don in every sense, suspicious of outsiders, addicted to tribute and ritual respect, and convinced that power flowed from fear, and fear alone. On the other side stood Salvatore Maranzano, and he was something altogether stranger. Maranzano came from the Sicilian town of Castellamare del Golfo, and he arrived in America already a man of standing in the old honored society. He had studied for the priesthood in his youth. He spoke several languages. And he was obsessed, genuinely obsessed, with Julius Caesar. He read about the Roman Empire the way other men read racing forms, and he dreamed of organizing the underworld into legends, with himself as emperor. 2 old lions circling one throne. Beginning in 1930, their factions went to war across New York, and the killing ran month after month. Gunmen ambushed each other outside social clubs and restaurants. Loyalties shifted in the dark. Ordinary business, the actual earning of money, strangled almost to a stop. Exactly as Luciano had always known, war would strangle it. And where was Luciano in all this? Officially, he was Masseria's man, one of Joe the Boss's most valuable lieutenants, running rackets that earned millions. Unofficially, he was watching both old men the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. Because to Luciano and the younger generation on both sides of the war, men like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, this entire conflict was madness. Thousands of dollars a day burned so that one elderly Sicilian could take ritual precedence over another. Young men dying in the street over a quarrel rooted in village politics, from an island most of them barely remembered. To Luciano, the war wasn't a power struggle. It was the final, screaming proof that the old system deserved to die. So he decided to kill it, both halves of it. The first move came on April 15, 1931, at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. Luciano invited his boss to lunch. Masseria ate enormously, as he always did, and afterward the two men lingered over cards. Then, as the story goes, Luciano excused himself to the men's room. While he was gone, 4 gunmen walked in from the street and shot Joe the boss to death at the table. The killers, it said, were men from Luciano's own circle, the new generation executing the old. By the time police arrived, there was nothing to find but a dead man and Charlie Luciano, who calmly explained that he had been washing his hands and had seen nothing at all. The war was over almost instantly. Maranzano had won, or believed he had. And now the Roman scholar revealed his dream in full. Some weeks later, Maranzano summoned hundreds of Italian gangsters to a grand banquet in upstate New York and reorganized the entire underworld of the city along the lines he had taken from his beloved Caesar. There would be 5 families in New York, each with a boss, an underboss, lieutenants, and soldiers. A structure, it must be said, that would endure for generations. Luciano himself was given command of what had been Masseria's organization. But Maranzano placed one thing above the 5 families: himself. He took the title Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, and made every family his tributary. There's a real irony in this. Maranzano was also a modernizer in his way. He also saw that the underworld needed structure. But his answer to chaos was a crown, a single Caesar sitting above everyone. He had replaced the old disorder with something even older. Luciano understood immediately what that meant. Emperors do not tolerate talented, popular, independent-minded subordinates. And sure enough, within months, word reached Luciano through the underworld's whisper network that Maranzano had drawn up a list of men who needed to die for the empire to be safe. Luciano's name was on it, so was Genovese's. Maranzano had even, it was said, arranged the contract with a killer from outside the Italian world, a young Irish gunman named Vincent. Mad Dog, Call. Maranzano invited Luciano to a meeting at his office suite in the Helmsley building on Park Avenue, a business address in the daylight world, high above Grand Central. Luciano was expected on September 10th, 1931. He didn't come. Instead, that afternoon, 4 or 5 men walked into Maranzano's office showing badges, announcing themselves as government agents, tax men. Nothing unusual for a man with Maranzano's paper empire of front companies. His bodyguards, wary of gun charges, were unarmed. The visitors lined everyone against the wall. Then they took Salvatore Maranzano into his private office, and they killed him, with knives first, to keep it quiet, and then with bullets, when he fought. The assassins were not government agents, and they were not Italian. They were Jewish gunmen, arranged through Meyer Lansky's side of Luciano's world, the very alliance the old Sicilians had sneered at, walking through the emperor's door, wearing the disguise of the American state. The last Caesar of the old Mafia died in his office, 5 months after the last of the old dons died at his dinner table. Legend says that in the days that followed, dozens of old guard Mustache Petes were purged across the country in a single coordinated bloodletting, a night of the Sicilian Vespers. Historians have looked hard for those bodies, and mostly haven't found them. The Great Purge appears to be myth, a story the underworld told because it felt true. And in a sense, it was true. Even if the old men weren't all killed, their world was. Between April and September of 1931, the age of the old dons ended. What had died was the old mafia of feuds, tribute, and jealous little kings. What rose in its place was something no one had ever seen before: a modern syndicate. Because now came the decision that separates Lucky Luciano from every boss who came before him. The throne of the boss of all bosses stood empty. Luciano had the power, the prestige, and the loyalty to sit on it. Every precedent of the old world said he should. He refused. He abolished the title of boss of all bosses, and in its place, still in that same year, 1931, he helped create something the underworld had never had: a board of directors. They called it the Commission. Think of it for a moment the way you would think of any corporate structure, because that is exactly how Luciano thought of it. The 5 families of New York, plus the Chicago outfit of Al Capone's successors, plus the family in Buffalo, each held a seat. Each boss remained supreme within his own organization, the way a division head runs his own division. But matters that crossed family lines, territory, joint ventures, the approval of new members, and above all, the killing of any made man or boss, those now required the Commission's consent. Murder, in other words, now needed a board vote. It sounds almost absurd when you say it plainly. But consider what it replaced. In the old world, any insult could become a war, and any war could burn for a decade. Under the Commission, a boss who felt wronged brought his grievance to the table. Arguments were heard. Interests were weighed. Sometimes the answer was still death. This was not a peace movement, and the Commission would sanction some of the most infamous murders of the century. But death became a policy decision rather than a reflex, and policy decisions, unlike reflexes, could be predicted, negotiated, and priced. Luciano took the family he had inherited from Masseria and ran it less like a fiefdom and more like a diversified corporation: gambling, loan sharking, the waterfront, and quiet stakes in legitimate businesses. Territories were mapped and respected. Disputes between soldiers went up the chain instead of into the street. And crucially, the partnerships he had built as a young outsider now became national infrastructure. The Italian families worked alongside Lansky's people and other Jewish organizations in a broader web that newspapers would eventually call the National Crime Syndicate. Lansky handled money like a private central banker, moving profits into casinos, real estate, and eventually offshore accounts. Enforcement itself was partly contracted out to a specialized crew of killers the press nicknamed Murder Incorporated. Assassination, as a managed service, used sparingly and only with approval from above. Ideology didn't come into any of it. Profit did. Luciano is supposed to have said that there is no such thing as good money or bad money. There is just money. Whether or not he ever spoke those exact words, he certainly lived them. And notice what he personally became within this system. Not an emperor. Something quieter and far more durable. First among equals, the man whose judgment the others trusted, the chairman whose real power was that everyone at the table was making more money and losing fewer men than they ever had under the old regime. By the mid-1930s, the empire hummed. Repeal had ended Prohibition in 1933 and killed the bootleg fortune. But the organization simply pivoted the way good companies pivot, deeper into gambling, unions, loan sharking, the docks, and the slow colonization of legitimate industry. Luciano himself lived at the Waldorf Astoria, one of the finest hotels on earth, in a tower suite registered under the name Charles Ross. He dressed like a banker. He went to the theatre. He tipped well. Most of his neighbors had no idea who he was. And here, at the height of it all, the audience of history looks at this man, this fifth-grade dropout, running a continental enterprise from a hotel suite, and the realization lands. He was never the biggest killer in the underworld. He was its best executive. But there is a rule that governs empires of every kind, criminal and otherwise, and it was already beginning to operate. Success on that scale cannot stay invisible. Every dollar the syndicate earned cast a shadow, and the shadows were adding up. The first to notice were the police, not the precinct cops on the payroll, but the reformers above them, the ones who kept asking how a known gambler lived at the Waldorf. Then the politicians, who found that the same newspapers that had glamorized bootleggers were now, in the grim years of the Depression, running headlines about rackets that taxed the price of bread and poultry and every truckload of goods entering New York. Public opinion was souring. Ordinary people, squeezed by hard times, were beginning to understand that organized crime wasn't a colorful sideshow. It was a hidden tax on their lives, and they were paying it. Washington had already shown what it could do to an untouchable boss. In 1931, the federal government had sent Al Capone himself to prison, not for murder, but for taxes, proof that the state, when sufficiently embarrassed, could find a door into any fortress. And then, in the summer of 1935, New York produced its own weapon. The governor appointed a special prosecutor with sweeping powers to investigate organized crime in Manhattan, a young Republican attorney, barely into his 30s with a neat mustache, a choir boy's face, and the ambition of a Roman consul. His name was Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was, in his own way, everything Luciano was in his: methodical, organized, patient, and allergic to waste. He recruited an elite staff of young lawyers and accountants. He studied the rackets the way Luciano had studied the old gangs, looking for the structural weakness. He had already driven one of the era's most feared gangsters, Dutch Schultz, into hiding by sheer legal pressure. And in October of 1935, Schultz proposed to the commission a simple solution: kill Dewey. The board said no. Killing a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring down the entire government on their heads. It was terrible business. Schultz raged that he would do it himself. Within days, gunmen from the syndicate's own ranks shot Dutch Schultz in the men's room of a New Jersey chop house. He died slowly, feverish, mumbling nonsense to a police stenographer. The system had worked exactly as designed. A reckless man had threatened the enterprise, and the enterprise had removed him, by consensus, cleanly, with a vote. But step back, and you can see the trap closing. Because with Schultz dead, Thomas Dewey was alive, ambitious, and looking for the biggest target in New York. There was only one. Police, politicians, prosecutors, federal agents, the newspapers, the public. One by one, every force in American life was turning its face toward the quiet man in the Waldorf Tower. None of them alone could touch him. Luciano was insulated by layers of men and money, and he knew it. He had built the layers himself. The tension of these years isn't in any single event. It's in the slow, grinding sense of inevitability, the feeling of a tide coming in around a man who believes he is standing on high ground. Dewey's investigators began pulling on a thread that seemed at first almost beneath the great man's notice. Of all the rackets in New York, they focused on the saddest and least glamorous one: the organized control of prostitution. Through 1935 and early 1936, Dewey's men quietly mapped a combination that had taken over hundreds of brothels in the city. taxing the women who worked in them, bonding the madams, and enforcing it all with the usual muscle. The street name for the operation's protection was simple. The bookers and madams paid, they said, because the combination belonged to the top man. To Charlie, Lucky. In the early hours of February 1st, 1936, Dewey's raiders hit dozens of brothels across New York in a single coordinated sweep, arresting the women and the bookers by the score. And this time, instead of processing them through the usual revolving door of night court, Dewey held them, questioned them, protected them, listened to them. And slowly, in those interview rooms, some of them began to talk. Now, before we walk into the courtroom, it's worth pausing on why convicting a man like Luciano was considered close to impossible. Everyone in New York knew who he was, but knowing and proving are two very different things. Luciano gave no orders in writing. He owned almost nothing in his own name. Between him and any actual crime stood layer after layer of intermediaries, each of whom understood that testifying against Charlie Lucky was a form of suicide. Witnesses in Underworld cases had a way of changing their stories, leaving town, or turning up dead. Juries were frightened. Some judges and politicians were bought. This was the whole point of the system he had built. The profits flowed up, and the risk stayed down. Prosecutors had been staring at that wall for years. Dewey's insight was that the wall had one soft spot. The prostitution combination was the lowest status racket in the empire, run through people the organization considered disposable, bookers, madams, and the women themselves. Disposable people are treated badly, and people who are treated badly will sometimes talk if someone protects them. Dewey also had a new legal weapon. New York had recently passed a law allowing prosecutors to join related offenses into a single trial, to charge a criminal enterprise as a pattern rather than as isolated acts. Instead of proving one crime beyond doubt, Dewey could present dozens of counts, dozens of witnesses, and let the sheer weight of the pattern speak. On April 1st, 1936, the indictment came down. Charles Luciano and a dozen co-defendants charged with compulsory prostitution. Some 90 counts between them. Luciano wasn't in New York to hear it. He had slipped away to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a spa town so thoroughly corrupt it functioned as a resort for the underworld. And for a few surreal weeks, his lawyers and friendly local officials fought extradition, while Dewey raged in the newspapers. New York's pressure finally won. In handcuffs, aboard a train, the boss came home. The trial opened in May 1936 in the Supreme Court building in Lower Manhattan, and it had everything the tabloids could dream of. The boy prosecutor against the emperor of vice. The city hung on every session. Dewey's case was a mosaic. He called the bookers who had collected for the combination. He called madams with decades in the business, and he called the women, one after another, who described the mechanics of the operation, the bonding fees, the collections, the beatings, the $10 transactions from which the organization skimmed its share. Piece by piece, he built the pyramid upward from the brothel door toward the Waldorf Tower. At the top, the mosaic thinned, and everyone knew it. Only a handful of witnesses claimed direct contact with Luciano himself, among them a faded booker named Dave Marcus, and most famously, a gaunt, drug-addicted woman the papers called Cokie Flo Brown, who testified from withdrawal, wrapped in a coat, and swore she had sat in on meetings where Luciano discussed running the combination like a chain store business. The defense tore at these witnesses with everything it had. They were addicts, convicts, people testifying to save themselves. Some would later recant, then recant their recantations. To this day, historians argue about how much of that top-level testimony was true, exaggerated, or coached. And the audience in 1936 wondered exactly what you may be wondering now. Can they actually prove anything? Then Luciano's lawyers made a mistake that law schools still talk about. They put him on the stand. He was calm at first, polished. A gambler, he admitted, nothing more. But Dewey had prepared for this moment the way Luciano had once prepared the fall of two bosses. On cross-examination, hour after hour, he walked Luciano through his own life. The 1916 heroin conviction, the arrests, the lies on official documents, the gun permits, the tax returns that existed only after prosecutors got curious, the phone records connecting his hotel to the combination's men. Luciano's answers grew slippery. "I don't remember." "I might have." He was caught in small lies, then larger ones, until the jury was no longer looking at a businessman. They were looking at a man whose entire respectable surface had been peeled away in public. On June 7, 1936, after deliberating through the night, the jury convicted Luciano on every count against him. 11 days later came the sentence, and it landed like a hammer, even on people who hated him. 30 to 50 years in state prison, at the time, the longest sentence ever handed down in America for compulsory prostitution. The judge made the meaning plain. The sentence was not really about the brothels. It was about everything the state knew and could never charge. They sent him north to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, hard against the Canadian border, a fortress so cold and so remote that inmates called it Siberia. The tabloids celebrated. Dewey became a national hero, launched toward a governorship and very nearly the presidency itself. The greatest criminal executive in America was now prisoner number 92168. And most stories, told by most tellers, would be ending right about here. But this story doesn't end here, because the whole point of what Luciano had built was that it did not require his physical presence. The organization simply kept running. Before the prison doors closed, control passed smoothly to his underboss, Vito Genovese, and when Genovese fled to Italy to escape a murder charge, to the supremely diplomatic Frank Costello. The commission met, the money moved, the structure held, exactly as designed. A corporation doesn't stop, because its chairman is away. And the chairman was never truly out of reach. Messages flowed in and out of Dannemora through lawyers and visitors. Decisions of consequence still bent toward the man upstate. Luciano, in prison, remained more powerful than most bosses at liberty. Then, in the winter of 1942, the outside world came to him. And it came, wearing a United States Navy uniform. America had just entered the Second World War, and its harbors were bleeding. German U-boats were sinking ships within sight of the Atlantic coast. Naval intelligence was terrified of sabotage and espionage on the New York waterfront. And on February 9, 1942, the great French liner Normandy, being converted into a troopship, caught fire and capsized at its Manhattan pier. Accident or attack? It hardly mattered. The Navy looked at the docks, that seething closed world of longshoremen and Union locals, and understood that it had no eyes there at all. But someone did. The waterfront belonged, and had long belonged, to the syndicate. So began one of the strangest partnerships in American history, known in the files as Operation Underworld. Naval intelligence officers quietly approached the mob's fish market boss, Joseph Sox Lanza, who told them that only one man's word could open every dock in the harbor. Through Meyer Lansky, of all people, the government of the United States opened negotiations with the convict in Siberia. Luciano agreed to help. The word went out along the piers. Cooperate with the Navy. Watch for saboteurs. Keep the harbor quiet. Strikes faded. Union cards appeared for undercover agents, and whether or not there had ever been a real German network to catch, the waterfront stayed secure for the rest of the war. Later, when the Allies prepared to invade Sicily in 1943, the Underworld's contacts and Sicilian knowledge were tapped again, though how much any of it shaped the campaign remains argued over to this day. Luciano, for his part, was moved to a more comfortable prison closer to the city, Great Meadow, where the visits were easier. He had extracted no promises. He didn't need any. The leverage was already there, and he knew exactly what it was worth. When the war ended, his lawyers filed for clemency, citing his services to the war effort, and the petition landed on the desk of the governor of New York, who was, in one of the era's better ironies, Thomas E. Dewey. The man who had built his career sending Luciano to prison now reviewed the file, confirmed with the Navy that the help had been real, and in January 1946 commuted the sentence. On one condition: Luciano, who had never become a citizen, would be deported to Italy, permanently. In February 1946, from a Brooklyn pier guarded by longshoremen who kept reporters at a distance, Charles Lucky Luciano sailed out of New York Harbor on a freighter, watching the skyline he had conquered slide below the horizon. Dewey's condition was exile. Luciano's answer came within months. By October 1946, he had slipped out of Italy, crossed the Atlantic, and surfaced in Havana, Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, in a hotel suite with a view of the sea. That December, the syndicate came to him. At the Hotel Nacional, under cover of a gala featuring a young singer named Frank Sinatra, bosses from across the United States gathered for what became known as the Havana Conference. Lansky, Costello, Genovese, representatives of families from New York to Chicago. They kissed his hand, or near enough. They confirmed his standing. They talked business, casinos, narcotics, the troublesome extravagance of Bugsy Siegel's new hotel in the Nevada desert. For a few weeks, the deported convict presided over American organized crime from a foreign shore. Then Washington found out. The United States pressured Cuba with threats to cut off legal drug shipments, and in early 1947, Luciano was arrested and shipped back to Italy, for good. Even then, distance never quite became absence. From Naples, watched constantly by Italian police, stripped of his passport, he remained a name that opened doors and closed arguments. American narcotics agents insisted for years that he sat at the center of the growing heroin trade between Europe and the United States, an accusation he denied until his death, and which historians still debate, some seeing a mastermind, others a fading legend that lawmen found useful. The truth is probably tangled somewhere between. What no one debated was the structure he had left behind in America, because it was still there, running without him, year after year. Which brings us, near the end of the evening, to a quiet question, the kind worth turning over slowly, in the dark. Did Lucky Luciano really lose? By every ordinary measure, yes. He lost his freedom for a decade. He lost America, the country he had lived in since he was 9 years old, the only place his empire ever truly made sense. He lost New York, the city he had mapped block by block since childhood, and spent his last 16 years circling it from across an ocean, an exile, in the land his parents had once fled. He grew older in Naples apartments and seaside cafes, giving interviews, feeding his own myth, half king and half tourist attraction. In January 1962, at the Naples airport, on his way to meet a producer about a film of his life, his heart stopped. He was 64. In death, he was granted the one return the law had denied him living. His body was flown home and buried in a family vault in Queens, New York. So yes, the man lost. But look at what he made. The commission he helped found in 1931 was still meeting and still governing, decades after his death. The 5 families whose borders were drawn in that revolutionary year still carried on under the same structure of bosses, underbosses, capos and soldiers into the era of television and then of the internet. When the FBI finally broke the American Mafia's power in the 1980s and 90s, the organization they dismantled was, in its bones, the one designed in 1931. Prosecutors needed a new kind of law to do it, a statute aimed not at crimes, but at criminal enterprises, at patterns and structures. In a strange way, the American legal system had to learn to think like Luciano before it could beat what he built. Almost every American mafia family, for more than half a century, operated inside the framework he helped create. Men who were born after he was deported, who never met him, who barely knew his story, spent their whole lives obeying an org chart he sketched. The empire outlived the emperor because he had built it, deliberately, to need no emperor at all. That is the strange, unsettling thing at the center of this story. Guns wear out, and bosses go to prison. But a well-designed system, once it takes root, is very, very hard to kill. It can survive its founder, its enemies, and even the purpose it was built for. Luciano didn't invent organized crime. He took something that already existed and rebuilt it from the ground up. And long after he left New York, that structure outlived the men who tried to destroy it, and most of the men who inherited it. What he left behind wasn't really a family, or a fortune, or a city. It was a set of rules that kept working without him. And somewhere in that thought, as the lights go down, is the reason we still tell his story. Not as a hero, never that. As a reminder of what one patient, organized mind can build in the dark. Sleep well, and we'll see you in the next one.